Good evening. Welcome to the latest installment of the Fall 2017 College of Architecture and Design Lecture Series. In a moment, I will introduce our speaker for tonight, Jim Stevens. Before I do that, I should probably tell you who I am. If you don't know, I'm Scott Shull. I'm Associate Dean, Associate Professor here at the College of Architecture and Design. As recommended by our Dean, I would like to offer a special welcome to those of you viewing us. How many people do you say are viewing us online right now on YouTube, Jim? At least 3,000? No, that was 3. 3. Welcome to the 3 of you out there. I think you all photographed your computer screen to Jim and texted it to Jim to show him that you were watching. Also, welcome to the thousands of people that will watch Jim Stevens' lecture in the future. I think you are trying to beat Carl, who has 300 and some odd views right now. So those of you who want to kind of stack the odds, feel free to loop that in or call some bots in India or something to get Jim to win. We do have a variety of majors here. Obviously, Jim is going to talk a bit about architecture, and we do have a great program in architecture. We also have programs in game art, interaction design, graphic design, interior architecture, urban design, a litany of others. What other? Industrial design, transportation design. I usually rattle them right off. I'm nervous in front of the 1,000 future viewers. So Jim Stevens, that's why I'm here. So Jim Stevens, a couple pertinent points. He is the current chair of architecture. He is also associate professor in our architecture department. It's been my great pleasure to work with Jim since I've been here in a variety of capacities. Jim has recently served as a Fulbright Scholar to Albania at Polis University. I believe there's a logo up there to verify I'm telling you the truth. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of Ferrara in Italy in partnership with Polish University. In 2015, Jim, with Ralph Nelson, who I just saw wearing beautiful blue pants down there, published a book, Digital Vernacular, which I believe is available for purchase. It's still, yeah, on Amazon, right, and all your local booksellers by Routledge. Jim is also the founding director of the Make Lab. The Make Lab serves as a kind of a center for research and publication, specifically around digital fabrication and the questions posed. And for me, the Make Lab was a moment where Lawrence Technological University became clear, and specifically how it interfaces with the College of Architecture and Design. Is that I entered this place thinking technology meant gizmo, right? Meant the latest and greatest kind of gadget. And through working with people like Jim, began to realize that technology colors far more of what we do, right? And indeed shares a root, as I've probably told many of you as you were touring this place. I've taken this now on as like a part of our DNA, and I believe it is that technique shares a root with tectonic and technology. And those 3 things intertwine. The apparatus by which we produce our work changes the nature of the work, and the work changes the nature of our practice. And our practice changes the demands we place upon the technology that completes the loop. And I believe Jim's work and the work of his students epitomizes this trajectory. And the thing that's most remarkable about it is he does it with a great deal of humility and at an incredibly modest price point and a spirit of that MacGyver, I think, would blush at. And it's that I brag about most, is that the innovation that occurs out of the Make Lab with the amount of resources that Jim has afforded is just outstanding. And it's, I think, a mark of pride in this place. I know it's a mark of pride in the place, and I know it's a mark of pride for me when I share the work of the Make Lab with potential students, with current students, with colleagues around the world. So I'm sure that you will, as Jim shares the work of him and his students, I'm sure you'll see a lot of that. The other thing I'd like to remark is it's been my pleasure to work with Jim in a variety of capacities. First, he was a faculty member as I was chair, and now as I'm associate dean, he sits in the office next door to me with the big conference table, of which I'm quite jealous, as chair. And in all of those capacities, I find Jim's intelligence, creativity, and humility to be remarkable. He's the kind of person that can deliver a biting retort, but do it in a charming southern drawl that makes you say thank you. And that is something I appreciate as well. And so hopefully all of those things will be evident in the lecture you're about to see. And I hope you're as excited as I am to welcome Jim Stevens up. So Jim.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate everybody coming. And tonight, I'm going to do something a lot different than I normally do. I'm going to talk about a topic within my work that's not fully complete. It's not fully baked. And so, with no pun intended, it's going to be risky on my part. And I'm going to talk about digital risk and the risk that we take in digital fabrication and using digital applications. And I'm also, everything I'm presenting to you today comes from the time that I spent in my sabbatical in Albania at Polish University. And some of the work that you see that I've put up out in the hall is also related to that time period. And in a lot of ways, I was thinking about it today as this was sort of my version of a pinup. And so I think a lot of you suffer through pinups, reviews, and final reviews, obviously. And in my sense, this is a pinup. And so I can actually use the feedback. I can use your comments at the end and even your challenges to this work that'll help me kind of drive it forward. But before I get started, I have to make really, really clear, and so there's no doubt, when I talk about the work of the Make Lab, that is not me. It really does take kind of a village in a sense. It's a lineage of research assistants and lab assistants and honestly, volunteers, students who have come and worked in the Make Lab on a variety of projects have really made the work what it is. And so it's kind of a long chain of people. And so that's an important thing to understand. So in many ways, it's a research laboratory that operates much like a practice in that way. By the way, this photograph at the top, and I'll do the whole full screen thing. The photograph at the top is looking at the Bora and Drini rivers. I'm standing at the Castle of Skodra, and I'm looking towards the Adriatic Sea. And this was in February on a crisp, beautiful, like 60-degree sunny day on my sabbatical. Just kind of rubbing that in a little bit. But I wanted to kind of start out with kind of the context of the place in which I was working during this time. The other thing that's on this slide that's going to become important later is I'm also going to arrange this lecture by the institutions, for a lack of a better term. So by the individual entities in which where I did the work, how they were funded, and how they were involved in not only facilitating the work, but enabling me to do the work, which is really, really important. And so all of these things are kind of overlapping, so it's not necessarily chronological, but it was the most logical way to present the work to you. I'm gonna show you these slides because AIA asked me to. So for the AIA members that are receiving credit and learning all four things, huh? Yeah, hopefully I'll get credit, yeah. Can I get credit for my own lecture? I don't know. But in the end, what I'm going to talk about is this topic of digital risk. And there is risk inherent in everything that we make, regardless if we make it with our hands in a manual way, or if we make it with a digital tool. So the first, I guess you could say, entity that made a lot of the work you'll see here is obviously the Make Lab. And this is my studio cow. I called it my studio cow because my studio at Polish University in the photograph was kind of on the top floor in the middle, and they would tie this cow in the field, and it would graze and make these perfect circles because his rope would only let him go a certain distance. So it was just amazing. And he just became my mascot, I guess. But the Make Lab, in a lot of ways in this lecture, is to give everyone here who's not familiar a little bit of background. And I'm not going to talk a lot about the past work, but it is important to say that the first years of the Make Lab, which really was, I would call 2010 to 2015, was an attempt at understanding how to position digital tools in a productive mode of practice. And so a lot of the projects that we did, as you see the one here that we're constructing, the conference room that we built in Illinois, we did these projects, and in many ways it was kind of like if we had an opportunity and we could afford to do it, or the funding was provided to us, we just did it. And some of the students that worked on these projects are in the audience tonight. But every opportunity was like, okay, how can we make these tools work in the time, in the place, and with the conditions that we're currently working? So this is our project that we did last summer in India, working with a traditional mason and a small CNC that we took with us. The large digitally fabricated, what we call a digital barn raising. It also had other names like the Manger of Danger, because I think it was around Christmas time. But we went to lots of different scales and a lot of different kind of deployment methods. And for me, it was a kind of a broad exploration of these tools and materials. And I never really limited the lab other than making sure that we were responding appropriately, given the limits in which we were working. And all of this really kind of ended up being a way that I was trying to describe how I felt like I was working. And it was one day in Ralph Nelson's office, and I was kind of talking to him about it, and I just said, look, all we're doing is vernacular architecture with digital tools. So we're just doing digital vernacular buildings. And his eyes lit up, and he was like, you need to elaborate on that. You need to extend that and do the research to be able to actually say that. And so through that process of Ralph's contribution to my work, we worked on this for a year, and before you know it, we had a book contract, and a couple of years later, we were publishing a book. But it was really looking at what that meant, what it meant to work in a way that was I'd say, responsive to the local conditions, to local knowledge. It viewed digital tools that, in really a post-digital way, where they're ubiquitous in our society and that we can have access to them. And so how does that change the model? It was no longer these things that were only existing within labs in a refined way, that it was really open to anyone that could get to it. And so we tried to define for ourselves within this publication what that meant for design. And so that was published in 2015. In a lot of ways, it served as a moment for me to kind of pause after it was done. Well, first, I just didn't do a whole lot for a few months. I don't know if my wife who's here tonight would agree, but I really took a deep breath and was like, what is all of this kind of, what do I do next, basically? And in that time, I feel like I got really lucky because of the timing, where I received a Fulbright scholarship to travel, live in Albania for 7 months, and basically kind of reflect on my past working on the book and kind of see where that carries me forward. And so the Fulbright, so now he's the Fulbright cow, my studio cow. But the Fulbright really enabled me to go and spend an extended period of time in a country that I had not lived in, I'd visited many times. So before we get too far, I'm going to explain where Albania is. My mother actually asked me, or left a message, I think, hopefully mistakenly, to be careful in Argentina. So it's not in Argentina, it's Albania. So it's essentially between former Yugoslavia, which is now Montenegro, Macedonia, and Kosovo. And to the south is Greece. And you can kind of see it there on the map. But what really, to me, makes it a really interesting place to visit is that it's at this confluence between the East and the West. It's part of Europe, obviously, but the Balkans is always being kind of pulled from the East and the West simultaneously. And that can be quite literally, meaning they've been occupied by just about every country that they border, including Italy during fascism, the Ottomans or the Turks during the Ottoman Empire, and of course, to the north with Serbia and Yugoslavia. So it's a place that is not necessarily defined by governmental borders, but by ethical borders, or I'm sorry, ethnic borders. So there are a lot of very, very complex issues at foot, and for me, it makes it a very rich place to visit and also to attempt to understand. But something that means a lot to me as an architect and as a designer, and particularly in the area of architecture where I do my research, is the implications that the communist regime had on Albania. It was very different than Yugoslavia. It was very different than Russia, in that it was very, very isolated. And many people compare it to North Korea in that sense. There was not, they were very isolated. They were not allowed freedom of movement. They were not necessarily allowed to travel. They were, in many cases, many parts of their lives were controlled. And this is Enver Hoxha, who controlled Albania from 1944 to 1985. And as I understand it, that's the longest non-royal ruler of a Western country in the 20th century. So he definitely had a stronghold on the country. But through this, there was a consolidation. There was a consolidation of farming. There was a consolidation of all industry, of all land ownership. Everything was owned by the government. And something that's not talked about very often, normally you hear about religion, you hear about industry, but it was also the crafts in that country were also diminished during this period. So if you were a metalsmith, if you were a mason, if you worked with plaster, you were then basically forced into a guild or a co-op, and you were kind of told, okay, you're going to work on this. And more importantly, exceptional work. Exceptionalism within craft and making was not necessarily, well, it wasn't seen as a good thing. It would have been seen as kind of an affront to the party. And so, unlike many of the other countries where that may not have been true, that was true in Albania. And it's not like America did a much better job, because through our capitalism and through industrialization of the Western world, we also lost the ethic of making and the understanding of craft. But the difference is that excellence always persisted here. So even at the height of the Industrial Revolution in England with the arts and crafts movement, in the United States, there was always somebody standing out that made a case for something to be made by an individual. I think this is a particularly important, by the way, she's way too happy. I'm pretty sure like she was like, okay, smile or not, right? But dig the ditch and smile. But I think it's really, really important to think about that in terms of digital technology and how that's changed. This is a photograph in 1991. Somebody mentioned earlier, like, why didn't I know about this? This is in 1991, and these are people fleeing the country when the communist regime fell. So everyone is trying to get on this ship to get to Italy. And this really led to a diaspora of the Albanian people all over the world. So in the United States, particularly in Italy. If you've ever been to Bari, Italy, it's like half Albanian. And of course, Western Europe and many other places. But at the same time people fled in the 90s, they also really, in an incredibly fast way, moved from the countryside, from the Alps or the lowlands, into the cities. So as you can see here, this is a photo by a colleague at Polish University where there's a 1994 photo and then 2007. And of course, now there's probably sort of mid-rise towers that are built there. And all of these buildings came before utilities or planning or anything. And so the need for Fulbright scholars to come into Albania is quite high in the kind of making, architecture, planning, and all of these areas, because they just simply have a long way to go to build their infrastructure to where it needs to be. And my colleagues at Polish University are kind of amazing because in many ways, and this is not an exaggeration, they are building the epistemological knowledge of urban planning and design for a country almost from ground up. There is a tradition from the fascists, but it's not really theirs, and so much of it has been destroyed. So for me, it's kind of a powerful thing to participate in and also be a part of. But it also leaves an architecture behind that is not necessarily planned, and there's a huge kind of tradition of informality in Albania. And this, again, is a photo by my colleague Loris Rossi in Albania of kind of comparing some of the architecture that you see in the city streets with the exquisite corpse or the surrealist game, right? This idea that things just kind of are stitched together in a haphazard way, that there's not a level of intentionality and planning that we are used to in the Western world. And by the way, this is pretty common in most of the world, but it's not necessarily common in Europe, all right? So that's a contextual thing to think about. Polis, being the other institution that I'm that I'm heavily involved with. That's the university in the background. If they're watching, they're probably horrified I'm using this slide with the cow because it's a very beautiful building from the front. But my connection with them was through my early work with the Make Lab and my desire to teach digital fabrication in different parts of the world. And my colleague now, but former student, Panduscauci, recommended that we go to Polis. And when we got the call, I said, well, could we design a CNC that fit in a suitcase and we could just take it on the plane for less than $1,000? And we said, sure, why don't we try that? And so this is before CNCs were really becoming this small. You couldn't buy necessarily kits of this size. Now there are a lot of these great kits that you can just buy them. So we built this ourselves and took it with us and built kind of architecture in another country with a suitcase that fit in our CNC. And for me, that was a moment where I was like, okay, if I can do that with something that fit there, then this is definitely a sign that this technology is becoming democratized, that this could really have an impact on this school and in this place. And so these are some examples of some of the early workshops with the CNCs that we took. So this is a parametric wall where we created molds and cast them. So I'm working with students at that time may have had a lot of experience actually in Grasshopper, but had never physically made anything from it. For them, it was a program that created geometry that they rendered. And so in my mind, this was a great moment to be able to transition that into the physical world. We kept going. We kept getting bigger and trying bigger things. Alec can tell me what year it was. I don't know, but it was a couple of years ago. He went with me, and along with, again, a colleague and former student, Brendan Veldboom, we designed a much larger CNC that we took with us. And the stuff that you see on the left is what we fit in our bag. When we went through customs, the Albanian customs agent said, "What's in that bag?" And we had it in a ski bag. And it was the middle of summer. And Brendan said, "It's a CNC." Why he said that, I don't know. And the Albanian guard said, "What?" And the other Albanian guard said, "He said it skis." And I come on through. And so that's, that's how we did it, and we got it in. And of course, we bought the wood there, and we assembled it, I think, in a day or two, and we had it running, and for the first time, we were able to cut much larger things. This has since been upgraded. The Z carriage now is much more robust. I took parts with me when I went on sabbatical, so they're able to cut, more dense material and lots of other things. So I tell you all of this to kind of give you the background to where I kind of landed at that moment of the Fulbright and the context in which I was working. So at this point, I essentially built, over a long period of time, through many trips and many heavy suitcases, a digital fabrication lab at Polish University in Albania. I even bought the dean's 3D printer that he used during his Rome Academy, American Academy in Rome time, and we even talked somebody into taking it in their car on the ferry over there so we didn't have to pay for shipping. So now they also have a 3D printer as well. And then I guess you could say the last entity which really kicked off during my Fulbright residency was my opportunity, which I never really thought that I would have, but it worked out kind of perfectly, to become a part of the Department of Architecture at University of Ferrara in Italy. And they have a series of funded positions. There are not that many for foreigners, and in this case, I was the foreigner. But I was lucky enough to receive one of the kind of funded PhD positions, and also that the required residency, which is essentially a semester, I was able to complete during my Fulbright time in my residency at Polish University, because they allow for residencies either in Albania or Italy. And so that began kind of this adventure of like, how now can I take this very broad mode of practice, which I feel like I was able to define in my earlier work, and really narrow it down and deepen it. And we talked to our graduate students about that. But this was my experience of trying to edit, narrow, and deepen. And I'll show you this, which is Andre Gerber's diagram, and this is his diagram of the history of architecture. And when I saw this the first time, I thought to myself, like, okay, I know as an architect that all graphical representation is an abstraction, right? And so when a historian or a designer creates the history of architecture, they clearly have their bias when they make it. So the things that are on top, the things that are bolded, are clearly more important to them. Maybe, does that mean they're more important? I don't know. But this was kind of where my head was when I started. It's like, how do I get all of these pieces and parts, and where do I fit in the puzzle, and how can I make a contribution going forward? And so with the help of Eric Naas, who's here tonight, and also with the guidance of Professor Plowright, who kind of in our early work about 9 years ago. Huh? Yeah, Dr. Plowright, sorry. Dr. Plowright to me. Good call, good call. With the help of, you weren't then, but I'll say it now. I remember when he was Philip. But he also kind of helped me do these mind maps and kind of put together kind of different histories of things and how they may link together. And between that and Eric's help, we kind of built this mind map, not of the history of architecture, but really of the precedents and the literature search that I was doing at the time. So at the bottom are all the different texts. So the moral of this story is the first couple of 3 months of I did a lot of reading. And that's one of the great luxuries of a sabbatical, is that you actually have time to read. So a lot of the reading, you can see here at the bottom, some of the publications were a part of my earlier research, some of them were brand new. But this is our attempt to do it chronologically, but also to start grouping them together and what they mean to me and the different kind of positions that they were taking. And this kind of red squiggly line is defining the works that we felt like were really a tug or a pull or a comparison between the machine and the artisan. So the industry and the arts and crafts. And what was interesting to me when I really looked at it was that the authors inside that were not necessarily, to me, the most important in my work. It was all of the authors that were just outside of the line. And I think it's because they were interested in and cognizant of this tug of war, but they were making what I felt were really clear points about architecture, about design, that recognized it, but didn't get hung up on it as kind of an argument, for a lack of a better term. So some of the people that kind of stick out are David Pye, which I'll talk about a little bit later, Malcolm McCullough, who was recently here at our presidential symposium, and I can safely say most of the people in this room missed that, because I was there and you were not. But Kenneth Frampton and others, and I started kind of really looking at the dilemmas that they talked about, and in many cases it was the dilemma of the certainty of industry, the dilemma of the certainty of the machine. And that's what I decided I was going to struggle with for the next couple of years. And so in this, one of the things that I couldn't shake from the research was Malcolm McCullough's idea of dematerialized craft. And I'll just read this because it's quite important. It says, Malcolm McCullough has asserted in an impressive argument that the operation of digital technology defines a new dematerialized craft. The tactile shaping of material was viewed to have a parallel digital equal in computer clicks and bits. McCullough maintains that the act of craft can occur entirely virtually, regardless if the work results in a physical artifact. Craft is typically defined as a skill that has been practiced to achieve consistent outcomes. One might think of a potter at the wheel consistently creating the same vessel, or a welder fusing steel to achieve an expected shear load. Most definitions agree that craft is achieved by rigorous practice and displays evidence of a consistent and exceptional outcomes. Within this general definition, McCullough's observations seem to align. So it's like my gut told me that he was wrong. I'm like, you can't have craft without material. Like, that's ridiculous. I mean, that was my first gut instinct. And I talked about it with my colleague, Professor Ayad Kamath, and he was like, no, it's totally ridiculous, you know. But every evidence that I could find, every argument I would make actually said that he was right. Like it was like yeah. So I was hung up on that, and as Eric can say, I couldn't stop thinking about it because every time he came to meet with me, we talked about it. And by the way, I put this image up. This is of a 3D rendering in Autocad 11, which Carl and Dr. Plowright and I remember. And so I put this up because that's the context in which Malcolm McCullough wrote this. This was what he was talking about. This is the craft that he was speaking of at that time. Obviously, it's evolved, but it's an interesting thing to think about in the time that he wrote it. But obviously, from my earlier work with Ralph Nelson and digital vernacular, a lot of the influence in that book came from David Pye. And so I contrasted that with what McCullough was saying. And I said, in a pre-digital context, David Pye clarified the similar distinctions between craft and industry, and by identifying the craftsmanship of risk and the craftsmanship of certainty. The craftsmanship of risk is a process where the quality of the result is frequently at risk during the process of making and is dependent on the judgment and care exercised by the maker. The craftsmanship of certainty requires comprehensive planning of the process prior to manipulation of the materials with all variables predetermined and pre-tested to the greatest extent possible. Digital tools now allow us to toggle errors off and on and further mitigate what Pye defines as risk and extends our efficiency towards completion. So he was writing this not even at a moment where we can design things and go, oh, I don't like that Control Z. Oh, I don't like that U enter, right? And so he was talking about that almost in an industrial way. But we've gotten to the point now that that risk and that error is just, it's not even an issue. Like, you know, we just do it again or save as, right? And so for me, that is something that within the profession we haven't spent enough time kind of talking about. So I kind of set out on the idea of creating a project that would be incredibly risky, but it would also require the use of digital tools, and see if I could learn something through essentially what amounts to an experiment. So a lot of the work that you see outside is not necessarily, they're not artifacts that are, you know, supposed to be in a gallery or behind glass or on the mantle of your fireplace or whatever. They're really the outcomes of what I felt like were an experiment to essentially a hypothesis that states that risk has value. Risk has value in making, and how can we manage that risk? And I'm not the only one. In fact, just as recent as last month, I went to the ACSA conference, which is essentially the conference for architecture professors. And Adam Marcus, a colleague at the California College of Arts, is doing a similar project where he's using a small Shapeoko CNC, which is now a perfect suitcase CNC, if anyone's interested. And he's mounting different types of soft pins on it to create what I think are quite beautiful drawings that he creates using parametric software. Now, what he says, though, is whether logarithmic, mechanical, or material in origin, the sources of what he calls noise are the cumulative and contingent. Together, they contribute to a sense of craft to the drawings that otherwise would not be present. The drawings begin to demonstrate the opportunities that lie within translations from bits to motion to matter, and the possibility of finding craft in computational modes of design and fabrication. Now, he and I talked about this, but I'm hung up on the word noise because noise is unwanted sound, meaning unwanted errors. And what I'm interested in is not noise or the unwanted. I'm interested in risk that we can manage and risk that we're aware of and that we're totally understand exactly what's happening. And so business management, or if you take a class in management, are really, really familiar with the idea of risk. And they study this, entrepreneurs study this quite a bit. And I'm showing you this video on the left because in 2012, I hope everybody saw this, but this guy jumped from 39,045 meters from a helium balloon. And of course, broke all kinds of records. But the interesting thing, and it only took him 4 minutes and 20 seconds to hit the ground after he jumps off this. You can watch it right here. It kind of takes your breath away. But when I first saw it, I thought, this guy is so stupid. But the reality is this. He's not necessarily stupid. He's clearly a lot braver than I am, right? But that is a managed risk that he just took. There was a large team of people, that guy clearly, who was in charge of his safety. They were the ones who were making decisions about, is this a smart thing to do or not? And so what I would say is that he took a strategic risk, one that I'm not willing to take, but he took a strategic risk. And trust me, making things in the Make Lab are not this scary. But the reality is this, that we can learn a lot from that, that we understand that we don't want to make things, I didn't want to do a project that was stupid, like everything broke or everything was wrong, but I wanted to do something that I could manage the risk, that it wasn't noise, right? That it was something that I understood. And so in my idea, that digital risk is predicated on the idea that risk can all but be eliminated from the act of making with ample preparation. And this, however, negates the inherent benefits that risk and reward that only making can provide. And so for me, testing risk became important. Like, how do I do this? And I'm very queasy about the idea of taking data on things that are very qualitative. But in the end, I still felt like that it was measurable in some ways. And so the way that we kind of broke it down, and I say we, I'm working with students in the Make Lab and colleagues in Italy and Albania who are advising me, but really looking at breaking it down into the tool. How do we manage the risk in the tool? How do we build the tool to ensure that it does what we want it to do? In the material, in the kind of tacit understanding of that material and the making of it. In the geometry, there's risk. Sometimes we try to make things that physically can't be made. Some of my students are here that are working on trying to eliminate double curves out of some of the things they're making because they know that's a lot harder than a single curve. And so that type of thing, working with the geometry. And then in a lot of ways, the most important one, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, is the human factor of the risk. So it's that craftsmanship of risk, meaning that I rely much more than I could imagine that I would have in the beginning of this project on a person and their tacit knowledge of how to work with tools. And so some of the questions within these measurements are, what role does handcraft play in digital making? Maybe it doesn't, right? And I would be okay to take that challenge tonight. But it's hard for me to imagine that it has zero role. Can risk in digital making be used productively? So if this risk is there and it's manageable, can it be used in a productive way? Can it inform some of our design decisions? And more importantly, inform how we set up projects so that we understand it. And so I kind of go back to some of the earlier research from the book where we looked at the idea that building your own tools, in my mind, is an essential act of being a craftsperson. I think if you look at this 15th century engraving, which it may be a little hard to see, but there's a guy in the center who looks like he's kind of working, and you'll see that he has a set of shears that he's fashioned I'm gonna point down here because I can reach it, but it's the letter E here. He's fashioned an axe handle on the end of his tin snips, and by closing the tin snips, he can hit the axe into the stump, and it allows him to work the tin snips with one hand. And this is something that Henry Petrosky pointed out in his publication, and he said it's the thoughtful craftsman that evolves their tools to meet their needs. And so we try to work in that way. On the right-hand side is David Pye's, what he called the float machine, which I'll show you in a minute how well, actually I showed you before, but this is the float machine where he actually uses the handle to carve his bowls. So he was doing carving into these kind of wood bowls, and he literally had to build the machine to make it do exactly what he wanted, and that he could control that risk. And if anybody's ever tried to turn a bowl, you'll know it's not easy, particularly if you try to finish it. So this was his way of managing that risk. So we set out to kind of create our own version of that, and this is what we ended up with. This is the early days of this large ceramic 3D printer that we built. Why did we build it big? Because we didn't know how tall we could print yet. So we said, well, let's just go ahead and make it large and see what we end up with. As you can see here, Bria's on the floor, which I'm working on getting her off the floor, hopefully, at the moment. But this is the z-axis, and it comes up, and as they move up and down, it also changes the x and the y. This is a very large tube of clay. The clay goes into a PVC. Air compression pushes the clay out and distributes the clay onto the part. So we relegated certain tasks to the hand and certain tasks to the machine itself. So the X, Y, and Z control of the machine, how it was moving as it traveled up, was entirely controlled by the computer, and how we set up the digital file. Sometimes we were successful, sometimes we were not. The mixing of the clay, the packing of the clay in the tube, and the air compression levels that distribute the clay were all done by Brie. And so what I was interested in is this chance, or is it something that can be learned in a skill? And so we kind of tracked that. But to give you a little more kind of background on the tool itself, again, we built it ourselves, made it ourselves. And again, Brendan Veldboom, one of my students, helped me with this. He kind of enjoys making these tools for us. We were in the middle of rebuilding this, which we'll talk about. You can kind of see it here. One of the biggest struggles that we had was that all of the 3D printers that we could find only printed in about this large of a diameter. So we had to change the coating on the actual board to allow it to go wider. So it was really only made for a small machine. So that took about a month to figure out how to do. And you'll find when you do this type of work, you end up in lots of areas that you didn't know that you would end up in as an architect. To complicate matters further, about the time we finished the machine and ran the initial tests, I left for the Fulbright. So for me, it was actually, well, at first I was kind of worried and upset about it, just the timing of it, not that I was going. But it actually worked out it was serendipitous, it worked out better. And the reason is that Brie was working in the Make Lab on the printer, and I was in Albania on my computer, and that we would meet through Skype regularly. And we were constantly sharing digital files. She was testing things. I was changing the parametric script. And what was interesting, though, is it isolated her to work on the tool. So there was one user. And I think if I had stayed, that may have been different. And so not only was it a kind of an international, if you want to call it that, making process that was not slowed at all by me being there, which is interesting, but it also had her with the material and me with the digital files, and it allowed us to kind of measure her ability to kind of improve. So some of the struggles that we had were material, and we kept this one because we like it. At one point, this particular piece of clay was on top of this one, and Brees here can probably tell you exactly how tall it was, but it was I think a little over 36 inches. Is that right, Bree? Do you remember? Is that right? Yeah. All right. So it was around 36 inches, but that's pretty tall. I mean, to be able to print and this is terracotta, to be able to print in terracotta that tall in one pass, we knew we were pushing it, but we were just going to keep printing until it fell. And so that gave us an idea of the material, how it would behave as it came out of the tool, and how long it would kind of stay in that position. We also looked at geometry, and the geometry is important because obviously with clay, it's not as easy to kind of put the support material in that you have in the plastic printers. You can do it, but you also have to plan for how that may break away. So we were looking first to decide what is the limit of the geometry itself. Will it fall, et cetera, based on a cantilever or on a slope. And so these are some of our early tests. You can kind of see the kind of cylinder there, or the cone, sorry, is cracking on the edges. It was also very difficult for us to, in the early days particularly, to determine if we had a material failure or a geometry failure, because we didn't know enough about the material. We didn't have the tacit knowledge yet to make that determination, but that's something that we can do now. And there were lots and lots and lots and lots of tests. And every test was recorded, and notes were taken on its success, on how it was, how the material behaved, how the geometry worked. If there was a human error, if it was an air issue. There were lots of different things that would determine its outcome. And this is a fraction of what we have on this screen here. We also had some major disasters, which, as you can see here in November, as soon as we started, this is my favorite one because it looks like Jabba the Hutt. But you can see what it was supposed to look like and what it really looked like. But it slowly got better. Again, what it's supposed to look like, but it kind of like meatloaf to me. And at this point, we could have gotten frustrated, but we kind of kept going. Here's one where we did work with kind of, it's not really bracing or support structure. It was more of building up an area to where the machine changed in the Z, but we did start to get better results at this point. We're also using this shape to determine maximum geometry. You can also look at this and tell that maybe one side the material was mixed quite well and on the other side, well, maybe not so much, right? So it collapsed mid-print. But we did gain a fairly good command over the tool. I should say Bree gained a good command over the tool. And we started to be able to print things that were fairly complex, that fit together roughly together. And we were even able to not necessarily predict with a lot of accuracy how these materials would change when we put them in the kiln and fired them. And so, you know, I think what I started to realize from afar in Albania was that this project was not necessarily about the tool and the material as it was about the tacit and human knowledge that went into running it. And so the human element is the most important. Really, Bree? It's not that bad. It's going to get better. There was discussion of printing one full scale and doing a cardboard cutout outside the door. She didn't like that. But literally, like to me, this photograph kind of sums it up. The tool exhausted her. Okay? I mean, that's important. It exhausted her to be able to print because she could not print and leave. You have to tend to that machine. She's working the machine literally with her hands and with her tacit knowledge in tandem with the digital commands. And that, so it's really in many ways is kind of a cyborg-like machine that conjures up all kinds of weird things, but that's how we were trying to work. And so one of the days where she looked like she had been up with it all night, we took this photograph. But it's an important thing to think about and realize. Also that there came a time where we had, I would say you could, for the most part, perfected, if there's such a thing, the recipe for the clay to ensure the viscosity of the clay was dense enough that it would stay on the part, it wouldn't collapse, but it was viscous enough to go through the tube. But the problem is that that recipe only gets you about 50% there. The rest of it is really her knowledge of kneading that clay, knowing how to do it, and feeling it, and knowing when it's ready. And so we've even done interviews with her, and it's like, can you articulate when it's ready? No, I just know. And that's not being difficult, that is tacit knowledge. It can't be explained. And so her hands in that clay are the only kind of way that we know. Could we develop a machine? Probably, that would make it perfect every time, I'm sure, but that's not what we're studying. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in this confluence between her tacit knowledge and a digital machine that operates through her commands as well. So the knowledge of kind of how you knead it, how you roll it, all that had to be learned. Pressing it in. And obviously we take, this is one that we documented where the cylinder is much smaller. It's much easier to control when the cylinder is smaller, although we've done the huge cylinder as well. If you're using a CNC or other machines or even a 3D printer using plastic, it finds its own zero. You've watched it do that. The way we find the zero is kind of lower it down, zero it, and then we build the clay bed up to match it. So that's also kind of the act of leveling is a part of what she does in the process. And so you can see several shots here of it working. Building up the part. We even kind of worked on how we could stack them and square them, manually. And we started to get pretty nice results. Those are two kind of facing blocks with very, very consistent clay, very consistent air control. That's her doing, not necessarily only the computers. So two blocks coming together again. So these are some of our most recent, but also better results. We started to stack them and look at the possibilities of what happens when we have different variations. So this is more of exploring the possible with this, not necessarily what we will end up doing with it. And outside the hall here, if you're interested, we have this collection of the units mounted on the wall. So we also attempted to take all of that data I showed you before and bring it into a spreadsheet and try to understand it. This is the most important one. And what you see going north there is the level of success, and to the right are the number of tests. This is only like 25% of the data so far, but we wanted to get it in to see if it made any sense. And this is the tool, the level of success of the tool. And I'll kind of come back to that at the end. But you'll notice it's incredibly inconsistent. It works really great, and then it breaks. It works really great, and it breaks. Whereas the material, you'll notice it goes up, and it stays up. That's her skill, hitting that moment of, like, she's got it. It's just steady. You can count on her mixing the clay and it being successful. This is geometry. We pretty much know what we can get away with at this point, so we generally don't print things that fail. I'm not really sure what happened on number 21, but we clearly, something messed up. But for the most part, we understand the limits of the objects that we're printing and how far we can push it. This is the air regulation. It's a bit up and down, but it is steadily going up, that she's understanding how the gauge relates to the clay, viscosity of the clay, and the movement of the machine, and more importantly, the Z steps that it's taking and how she compensates for that. It's still a little more inconsistent than we would like, but this is also related to the tool's inconsistency. And then the last one is digital command. This is really the G code, or the code that we output from our file on the computer, and that's just a matter of us getting better at it, and it's, for the most part, it's fixed. We know how it works. And so and by the way, on the bottom here is how we assess that. But what this has kind of led us to understand is that we have control of it. We think we have a system where we are hybridizing tacit knowledge and digital control, but we know that our tool isn't cutting it. It's not working. It's not consistent enough for the user to be able to count on it, that it can react to the feedback that they're receiving. So now we're in the process of completely rebuilding it, which is not uncommon for us after we've built a machine. So we're dismantling it, rebuilding it. I'm gonna get Bree up off the floor, because that kind of bothered me. It's like it really should be at her sitting eye level at this point. We don't need it as tall as it was. So we're gonna go through this process now of rebuilding this. So the last entity is Lawrence Tech, obviously. It's my home institution. None of this work obviously would have happened without Lawrence Tech. And some of the things that I think are relevant to Lawrence Tech and to me are some of the publications that either came out during my time there or I presented when I was there. And this is, I'm not going to read them to you. But because I was given the time by Lawrence Tech to take this sabbatical, I was able to get a lot of work done and to have things, either finish things that I started or have new things published. And then for any of the faculty members here that have had a sabbatical, there are also these kind of really amazing benefits that you can only have on sabbatical. The opportunity to kind of go somewhere and live somewhere you've never lived before. The opportunity that I was able to go with my family. I actually helped my kids with their homework for the first time probably ever, because I don't have time to do that when I'm here. And we were able to show our kids and our family were able to travel to many cities and many places and kind of do something as they are teenagers now, 16 and 14, something that we won't get to do again. It's like our last chance, right? They're going to be like you guys soon. So for that, I'm very, very grateful. And if it wasn't for the provost program, a sabbatical, and the support of the faculty council and the dean, it wouldn't have been able to happen. So thank you, and I'll take any questions you guys may have. Any questions? I'm gonna see if there's questions online. Yes, Tam.
Now that you're back, do you find that you've lost that time to read, or do you still?
Oh yeah,
Time?
yeah, it's totally gone. Tammy asked if I've lost the time to read, mostly. But I mean, the nice thing is that when we did the literature search, or when I did, and Eric helped me with this, we would read it, make notes on it, and then make connections to other readings. So it's almost like you build up this base of reading that now that I can go back to those notes, oh yeah, I read that there. You know what I'm saying? And I can make those connections kind of quickly, so it helps me a lot. Yeah, so I definitely feel like I wish I could read more. Yes, at least 4 questions from you tonight.
What does interest you in the vernacular materials? Why are you interested in them, and why are you doing research on the vernacular?
The materials themselves?
Either the architecture or the materials.
Well, I mean, I think there's a number of reasons. I mean, I think it's important for us to recognize that there's an ecological issue at foot. So if we're able to use materials that are local to the region, local to the area, that clearly I'm not having something shipped from the other side of the world. But I also think that, and in one of my readings that I was up in that diagram that I showed you, Kenneth Frampton talks about this, that we can have an architecture that's progressive while recognizing the place in which we're in. And so the thing that I would say is, I admired the work of Zaha Hadid, but I never understood why, if she did a football stadium in South America, it would look exactly like, material-wise, a football stadium in Qatar or in Europe. And so I think that, we, as a profession, need to be better, even though we live in a globalized, consumer-based world, that there are things that are more important that relate to culture and relate to place that go unrecognized for some reason because we're using a computer. We forget that. Any other questions? I didn't get any online.
You might have one that says it's not updating.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think you're on the wrong one.
No, I left this up.
Yeah, but I can see you on the YouTube.
Oh, really? Maybe I just haven't. Oh, there we go.
I've been watching, Jim. You almost doubled your.
Maybe it's like some sort of weird feedback, like I can't have myself on the screen. All right. Well, you don't see any on there, right? Okay. I don't like that. I don't like that at all. Okay, I feel better now. All right. Yes.
So it makes sense, why Albania, you keep going back, and it seems like history has kind of helped guide you to use there at Polish University, use that as a method to further your research. What do you see as potential for the MakeLab in the future? Is there anything that you envision expanding elsewhere, or is it just supposed to be, I guess, a model of something that can be replicated in other areas of the world as well? Does it make sense to
Yeah.
what you're saying about it being a global?
Yeah. I guess the easiest way to say is I don't have aspirations for populating MakeLabs around the world. There is the Center for Bits and Atoms at MIT has a system of fab labs that they have kind of populated around the world, including in Tirana, Albania. There's a fab lab there that is sponsored by MIT. So I think they've kind of have that taken care of, and they do a fantastic job at it. In fact, if it wasn't for that institution and the way in which they worked in the Center of Bits and Atoms, I don't think the MakeLab would exist, because they really helped democratize this technology. I think for me, it was just really setting up something in a place that I felt, there are a lot of, I'll give you an example. In Albania, there's a lot of missionaries there now, because the religion was essentially illegal for a couple of generations. There's also a lot of influence from Turkey and Saudi Arabia and other places building mosques. But nobody's actually saying, okay, well, what about the people that used to make things, and the masons and the stonemasons and the wood carvers that used to put the wood in the kula, which is the traditional house. No, that wasn't that I saw being addressed, and I felt like that that was something that I try to talk about when I'm there. And there is, I think, all emerging economies, if you want to call it that, emerging parts of the world they're having a hard time kind of distinguishing their own regionalism because they're in such a globalized context. Oh, do I? Is it Argus? Probably. No? Yeah, okay. That's a great question. Can you guys read that? Yeah, I will. No, she actually asked a really good question because she worked in the Make Lab and is asking this from the GSD as we speak. She said, given the process heavily relies on tacit knowledge, how do you plan on taking it further once Bree graduates? That's a great question. And I have had thoughts of that and fears of that. One of the things that we feel like needs to happen, and the reason we're rebuilding the 3D printer, is that right now it's almost too hard to use. Like, I kind of feel like it took us 6 months for her to learn how to use it and for us to be able to watch what she was doing and understanding what was important. I would like to be able to rebuild the tool so in a 1 or 2 week period, somebody could be using it with skill. But it's a great question. I mean, I think I've thought about it, and I'm very lucky that the timing worked out, that I was gone and had one person on it, so I could really recognize that it was the tacit knowledge that was changing the way that we were working. So, yes, Rob?
So I guess the other way to respond is you could say, well, what did we do when Ergus graduated? What did we do when Andrea graduated? Right? I just wanted to say it's a fantastic lecture. I really like the way you framed it in a historical and geographic context, and it's really great to see the evolution of the work. And like you said, you are taking a much deeper dive now, and I just like the way you're framing the whole endeavor and experiment.
Yeah.
But I guess we both have a common respect for David Pye's philosophy,
right.
And so I think picking up on the workmanship of risk is like there's a lot of territory to be mined there. It's great.
Yeah, and not talked about enough.
Not talked about enough.
And what I find is when I go to a conference every 2 years, sponsored by the Craft Council in England through the Royal College of Art, and there are a lot of architects there, and a lot of people are talking about risk, particularly the craftsmanship of risk in the context of digital tools. And when I go to ACSA, or if you go to Arcadia, I don't hear it as much, and that's why I was excited to see my colleague in Marfa talking about it. I'm not saying that everybody needs to, because it's not like it's it's not everybody's thing, but for me, if I'm going to develop tools and processes, making everything absolutely certain to me is not that interesting. Yes.
To follow up on that.
Yes.
But I think it does raise some professional issues for us, that notion of risk or other types of things, that if you have a client
Yes.
that commissions something,
Yes.
and there's a certain performance criteria, that risk could be problematic. I guess I was trying, and maybe this is related to it, I think you brought up questions about geometry and material, and maybe as an architect, I'm sitting here trying to imagine imagining a situation where geometry can't solve a material problem.
Yeah.
Maybe this is
Yeah, you can make it small enough, or a tool, right? Yeah, absolutely.
I'm trying to imagine a case when geometry can't overcome
Right.
shortcomings of material.
And one of the things that Brie and I struggle with is, like, when we were making notes on what happened, sometimes we couldn't tell if it was a material or a geometry problem, or if the material was bad but the geometry allowed it to work, right? So it's totally something that we struggle with. And anytime that you start documenting something that's so qualitative, it gets really, you get in the weeds of trying to separate what's going on. In terms of the client, I totally agree. And one of the things in my writing, I didn't talk about it tonight, but in my writing I talk about that in many ways architects have retreated, rightfully so, from being interested in taking, say, a material or process risk and into relying on kind of shopping or standardization for their selections. And that lends itself to kind of a consumer-based profession and a globalized profession. And in my mind right now, I'm not necessarily seeking to radically change that. I mean, if I was asked to do a building of any size today, don't think I would be out there, saying, let's make up a new, plaster for the wall. That's not what I'm advocating. I'm just trying to understand where that risk went. And I know that if you see a really exceptionally made artifact, if you sit in a Sam Malef chair, for instance, there's a lot of risk that went into making that. There's also a lot of tacit knowledge. And also I've seen beautiful things made by computers or even in factories that the certainty or the risk was eliminated and it was entire certainty. I mean, I'm sure we all have an automobile that we love, and trust me, that was not the craftsmanship of risk. There was a lot of certainty involved in that for economic reasons. So I'm not really, it's funny because in the Make Lab before, the work I did for digital vernacular, that was an argument for not an argument, but it was a mode of practice. This line of research I'm not seeing as a mode of practice, but really just trying to understand a component. And kind of back to your question, Trevor, and my vision, like when I'm done with this, I think I will have gone so far down the rabbit hole that I'm going to widen the lens right, but I'm going to be ready to do a building, trust me. I'm ready. I'm ready to go wide again. And I still have probably 2.5 years left on this. So, uh-oh, my wife has a question. That worries me, actually. All right.
Okay, so bear with me for a minute. All right, so looking at what you do from a...
Believe it or not, we don't talk about this a lot, do we? We talk about kids and
No, we talk about... what
carpool.
everybody does.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
So observing what you do from afar, but then also very, very close, from a Western standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
I find that it's interesting. As a Westerner, we are taught a certain value system in how we place value upon, building materials, placement, and all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the craft world right now, one of the hot topics, that is being discussed is that sort of Western value system. And, is it the only one,
Mm-hmm.
which, in my view, no.
Mm-hmm.
But as yours as well. And so what I think one of the things that you're doing, and you're very careful about doing this, is, when you talk about the West, the divide between East and West there in Albania, you are bringing your Western self with your, education.
Very Western.
Okay, yeah, you are. And what I think is of value is that you are not trying to, in a sense, colonize what they do.
Mm-mm.
And I think that that's important for people to realize is something that is important where you are giving them the tool, but they do what they need to do with it.
And that's actually frustrating.
Right, exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
yes, it comes.
Because I want to tell them what to do, but if I do,
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
so it's, I think that there are many interesting things about that. And so that sort of is something that you even took to India, where you were, combining their practices with the CNC that you guys had there. And so when you do that, when you're in that place, and when people confront you about that, how do you respond to them?
I actually don't get confronted a whole lot about it. And I think the difference maybe between what she's referring to in the kind of the art and craft world, there is more cultural attachment. And whereas I think there's a broader, at least in academia, a broader acceptance of the globalization of architecture. So if I go to India to CEPT University, all those students want to design buildings like Zaha Hadid. Same in China, same in Albania, right? So they want to be colonized, if you call it that with Western thought. But I think what I try to do in Albania is provide the tools and the guidance. But even in a recent interview, they interviewed me about this for an exhibition in Albania. I said, it's up to the young architects there to make that decision. I can't tell them, what to do. I'm actually worried about them not having a voice with some of the buildings being built there that are really being funded from outside sources, either in the Middle East or in the West. And so I'm worried that they may lose their kind of cultural built environment identity because it's just been overrun so many times that I'm not even sure they know right now what it is. And that's the trouble.
The global economy, the way that it is,
Yeah,
it's even
they all have an iPhone and know what they want. So, yes, Avi.
You said something about digital risk informing practice.
Say it again, I'm sorry.
You said something early on the lecture about how digital risk is going to probably inform practice or like direct practice in the future. How is that related to micro manufacturing? Sort of like you do bring up this point in one of your earlier lectures.
Right.
How a firm can have like micro manufacturing, sort of like studios. And
Well, I think we saw the micro manufacturing possibilities with Virginia Sanfitala's lecture last week, in that she's able to design something and then with a farm of bots build whatever, basically whatever she's designed. I think, again, and that may have been one of my questions to her that I didn't word very well, but like at that point it is sort of certainty. She's not going to send something to 100 printers that she's not certain is going to work, right? And so when I said it's going to inform practice, I'm not really sure how. It's informing my practice, but only it's research at this point. I don't actually know yet. And that's not a very good answer, but I'm too early to know. Zabi, how's it going? I haven't seen Zabi in a while.
Coming from Nigeria.
Yes.
Do you shape the places you intend to go to based on the approach, combination of the human factor and the machine factor? Does that shape places around the world you go to?
Well, and the only thing I can do is give you an example. So when we went to India, our idea was to build a parametrically derived clay masonry wall, and we hired a local mason. And the local mason was a part of our process. So he actually came to our critiques, which is really funny. And we were milling blocks and giving to him, and he was stacking them. We were also corbelling it based on the parametric script, so we were able to lean the wall out pretty far based on his tests that he did. So we didn't predetermine that. He actually corbelled a block wall till it fell, and then we put that into the script. So our goal in that was to make sure that he was integral to our process, and he was. And in fact, at the final review, he had some like really insightful things to say, right? So I think, including him as a part of the tradition of the area, using the local materials, and then taking our kind of tools to it, which are tools that are available to anyone there, and kind of combine those and see what happens. And as maybe Brooks said, and trying to do it in a respectful way was our goal. And we ended up with something. It's also another project where you look at the picture and you're like, oh, it's a funny shaped clay wall. It wasn't really about the wall. It was about all the steps that kind of took us to the making of the wall. Charlie.
I really appreciate the working with Masons, and I remember my favorite day quote was digital technology will never, or digital fabrication will never replicate or reproduce or get rid of the swift hand of a Mason. And just watching my Mason work, and when he dips the brick into the water because it's not accepting the water well enough.
Right.
There's a lot of knowledge there that we really need. And I think the word process and risk within the way you're speaking about it is really important. And so I guess this question is probably more for the students.
Okay.
And just could you talk a bit more about how important failure is?
Oh, yeah.
And especially in learning about materials, because the way that you're working with clay, I mean, you're not even talking about the 10% kind of shrinkage of clay over time.
Right.
And some of the shapes that you were showing where things are interlocking, that you really
Oh, yeah.
Think about that, especially over time. It's not like steel. It's laser cut and
Yeah.
it's just there.
Yeah.
It's got a life of its own.
There's a reason they're mounted on brackets out there. No, it's a great question. Failure is the most important part of this project. And there's a reason that I did a little mini pinup exhibit, and there's a reason that most of what I'm showing you is our failures, because to me, those were the most important things that we made, were the things that failed. And I think, in speaking to students, I think it's, failure is important as long as it's productive failure. And so when each one of those failed, you'll also notice that there's a series of notes and there was a series of actions that we took to make an improvement or to try another thing to see if it would fail. And so just simply failing isn't good enough. So showing up at your review going, well, it failed. But if you say, it failed, I know why, and here are the actions I'm going to take, then I think then it's useful failure. And for me, that's the good stuff. I don't know. I'm interested in those. In fact, some of the ones that we did that we really liked, we lost. They kind of like broke or kind of sad. Like those are the ones I want to fire and put on my fireplace, right? So those are the ones that mean the most to me. I don't know. I think where I went to graduate school, there was a long tradition of beautiful models and drawings. And the most important thing at that, and I loved my education, don't get me wrong, but like even at a pinup, we would make our own shelves for like pinups. Like it had to be like a gallery every single time. And although I learned a tremendous amount, but I never felt like failure was an option there. Like every model you made had to be like they would point out like, oh, well, that piece of basswood is, a 32nd of an inch overlap. I mean, that kind of thing. And that's probably what makes me crazy about, these things now. But I didn't feel like failure was okay. When I got here, I was like, well, if I teach, I'm going to allow my students to kind of mess up occasionally. Like, it's okay. Like, they need to do that. ID3 is sort of like, that's like all the time, right? So I think... productively failing stuff. But that didn't happen where I was. I mean, we would have made like perfect rock height little foundations and like everything would have had to have been perfect. And I'm still torn because I love beautifully made things. And so there are days that I look and I'm like, oh, I wish they would just make that nicer. But so, I don't know. I mean, it's important, but it's important to have also success at some point. Yes, Peter.
So what you presented, it seemed like at one end you have this perfection that technology offers us, and then at the other end there's failure.
Mm-hmm.
What about the moment somewhere in between where you have some kind of resilience where you find the edge, right? And between, at the threshold of failure. Are you interested in that as a...
I am. I mean, the way that I've always conceived it, and I've never really thought of it exactly that way, is kind of a beautiful way of saying it, but I have thought a lot about the successes that have the inconsistencies in them. That's the way I've thought about it. So if you look carefully at, well, you don't have to look carefully, but if you look at the collection that's mounted on the wall, although they're pretty regular and it's consistent, it's also, if you look really close, there's a lot of, like you can tell that it was being done by hand. And so it's not a nostalgic thing. It's more, there's kind of just like I like tool marks. I mean, I think there's something to the truth of how something was made. And if that is made by hand and you can tell it, but you're also somewhat confused because it looks like it's made by a computer, I'm happy with that. We haven't gotten, I don't think, good enough to say, okay, now we're gonna go for that moment like where we're right on the edge, but I hope that we do get to that place eventually. Alec.
I'm curious, when you were speaking about the ebb and flow of the development of digital fabrication, do you find value in eliminating risk, as you put it? Where, for example, in the 3D printer, the clay printer.
You can come in if you want. Wow. Go ahead, Alec. You scared him with your wisdom.
So with the 3D printer,
Yeah.
you talked about how you could have made a machine that would make the clay perfect every time.
Yeah.
But you made a conscious decision
Yeah.
not to.
And eliminate the air, like we could do the air control. Yeah.
You could make a machine
Yep.
that would do it
Yeah.
perfect every time. Do you think there would be value in doing that? Do you think that would push
Yeah, I mean,
making the craft further?
Right.
Or would it?
of course. I mean, I think when last week, Virginia's lecture shows the value in that. I mean, they had machines that did exactly that were really incredibly well made, incredible in consistency. And then she was able to take that tool and push it to another level, like playing with the G code and doing things that the risk wasn't necessarily there that I'm implying, but she took risk with the actual designs. Like, so she's innovating, giving the limits of that particular tool. You have to remember that what I'm doing with this tool is specifically researching an idea that's very narrow, right? And so it's not like I want to spend my career building machines that mess up all the time or that the prints always fail, right? I'm trying to figure something out so that as the Make Lab or as I as an architect kind of move forward, that I start to see the value in certain kind of haptic qualities and handmade qualities within a digital realm. But I mean, of course, if I could have the robotic, clay distribution, I would take it. Yeah, for sure. But then that would be a different project, right? And so, I try not to ever. I'm just saying this. I don't like manifestos in architecture. I don't like people say this is the way to work. When people say that to me, my brain just shuts down because if they think they have it figured out. This is just what I'm interested in trying right now and researching. I'm super interested in people that are doing it to a level of perfection. I'm also interested in people that turn pots by hand. So it's not one way is better than the other. It's just this is my way of understanding, exploring, and studying a specific thing about what we do in the Make Lab. And I'm looking forward to the day that I can widen that back out and say, all right, I'm going to make a really nice plywood wall again, or whatever I'm doing, or build a building, for God's sakes. It's about time.
We're
Done?
happy that you enjoyed your sabbatical, and we're really happy that you're back.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and I can answer questions later. Thanks, guys. Yeah, I'll just stand out there if you want. For some reason, this went to sleep, and it just doesn't want to wake up.
We were still broadcasting even though that was off.
Yeah, I don't know why. My computer just shut down.
It's all good.
It was done. Hey, thanks, man. Yeah.